Hey, good morning, everyone. Great to see some faces here, and hello, and thanks for being here this Sunday morning. How many of you are actually here last week? Just wondering. Yeah, you could raise your hand. Oh, awesome, great. And Connor, thank you for writing reflection. That was great, excellent. So feel free to leave notes or provide comments. This should be a pretty free form of conversation if you want to. So last week, I basically talked about the rationale of the topic of my talk. I really drag on talking about why this topic is important. And if you remember, the idea is that let me just move the video a little bit. Okay, so the idea is that as a trained Western psychologist, I'm very interested in how people deal with distress. And one of the most interesting topic and most important topic in Western psychology is actually the psychology of the self. And I think studying and understanding the self is very important. And this is not in conflict with the Zen teaching. So for example, I mentioned Dogen's quote, where Dogen talk about how if you want to study the way, you need to first study the self. And to study the self is to forget the self. I like this quote very much, and I think we all have different interpretation about it. But I think it is important to understand the self because it helps us to understand what is no self from the Zen perspective. And Dogen is not the only one talk about this. Of course, our teacher Shifu also talk about how before we can dissolve the self, we need to really affirm the self and transform the self. So this is related to what he talked about: face it, accept it, deal with it, and let it go. So last week I talked about how the most important psychology that's dealing with the question of who am I is the psychology of personality. And let me just move forward. And we went over some of the theories. And the key thing about personality theory, if you think about it, is really how different people think about the way they see themselves. Each theorist really have their own idea of what does it mean to be a person. And the way how they came up their theory in general are from two sources. One is more from a research perspective. So some psychologists, the way they study the self is through systematic approach, data collection. They use statistics, a lot of statistical techniques and surveys approach or experimental approach to test things out. Another major approach that psychologists use to understand the self is really through clinical work. So Freud would be an example of this approach, and many of his followers also use this approach. Personally, I would be more belong to the clinical approach. The way I understand people is really, a lot of it is really through dealing with people in the clinical settings. And here's the thing about clinical settings. Sometimes people think that you only see a psychologist when you have issues. I don't think that's the best approach or best way to utilize a psychologist. I would say people seek clinical assistance for two main reasons. One, of course, is to deal with issues, but two, is that to uncover potential. So I would say sometimes we don't study the self for the sake of understanding problems, but we study the self to uncover wisdom. So I would say these are two important aspects of the clinical work. Now, let me move forward. Last week, I also mentioned that there are many different theories, and everyone has a theories of their own in addition to psychologists. So although I'm talking about personality theories, I invite you to think about what are your ways of understanding people or understanding others. So we all have a story. In a sense, we all have a theory to understand how people behave and how we behave. So what is a theory? The theory is the best explanation we have about something, right? So we all have our ways of understanding others. And I mentioned that there are really three approaches that we use to understand self. And this also implied to you, right? There are three approaches. We have sort of a philosophical approach. Usually after we live our life long enough, we come up some kinds of epiphany of what people should be and how people should be, right? Confucius, for example, he's a philosopher and he believes that people were all born with great potential. People were all born with virtue. That would be like from Confucius' perspective. Some of us understand people through data, through a systematic data collection. Or another way how to understand this is that we tend to understand others and ourselves through data or facts, right? Facts that we have collected over time that help us to understand. And then artistic approach. Somehow the way we understand others help us to maneuver the world in a more effective way. So people who are good at reading people, we tend to call them street smart, right? So that would be like a sort of a artistic approach. And I think these are some of the philosophical points that I invite you to think about. So if you are here, this is just a review. For those who are not here, we'll just quickly go over. And these are some of, and this is just a demonstration on how data and facts are important, but how you put them together, so how you put them together is even more important. So science is not just about data collection, but science is really also coming up a good theory that can explain the data in the best effective way that help you to predict. And finally, a typical artistic approach of personality theory. And this is why all psychotherapists need to learn personality theory, is because it is very important in terms of helping us to understand people. In fact, I would say the whole process of psychotherapy is a process of learning oneself, understanding oneself, as well as freeing ourselves from our old self. Maybe that's probably a better way of putting it. So here are just some of the typical goals of psychotherapies. So any question for me so far before I move on? I think this is almost where we stopped last week. Any question from last week?
You can use the raise hand feature in Zoom if you have a question.
All look good? No issue? Carol, you look good. Yeah, you look happy, so I have to call you, you know. All right. And anything from the chat? Okay. Okay. Well, Wendy has a question for me. How to understand? I guess Wendy is asking how to understand the self. Okay. Well, that's my whole series of lectures all about how to understand the self. But how do you exactly understand the self? I would say one important factor that's true for both Zen practitioners as well as psychotherapeutic process is the cultivation of self-awareness, right? I mean, nowadays we talk a lot about mindfulness. What is mindfulness? Mindfulness is really the ability to bring your awareness to the present moment without conflict or opposition. And if you try it long enough, you will learn that it's not so easy to bring your awareness to the present because there's conflict. And the more you try, the more you learn about the conflict. And what's that conflict? The conflict is the self, right? And then you start to understand, hey, what are the things that draw me away from the present moment? See, right? When we meditate, this instruction is simple. Bring your mind to the present. And then people try it for 3 minutes, they realize they cannot do it. So the more you do it, the more you realize the obstacles of why you cannot do it. Right? That would be one way to explain that. This is true for Freud, for example. Freud's instruction back then for people were very simple. His instruction was just say whatever that's on your mind. Lay on the couch, relax, just say whatever that's on your mind. Easy to do? You think? Connor, you think that's easy? Just say whatever that's on your mind. No, right? In fact, people could do it for like the first 2 minutes and then realize they can't. So the whole process of psychoanalysis at the beginning, especially, was to analyze resistance. So anything that prevents you to become better, we call that resistance. So how do you understand the self? By understanding resistance. So when you meditate, you can't focus on your method. Why? You need to understand the resistance of it, right? So that's one more sort of using a therapeutic way of talking about it. Now, moving forward, let's move forward. And I guess this is where I stopped last time. So basically, not all theories are the same. Not all theory are the same. Some theory are more philosophical, some theory are more scientific, some theory are more artistic. So the way you apply them are different, and the way you evaluate them are different. This again, this is just to explain that there are many different theories and no one theory are true. So we need to be open-minded. We need to keep it open-minded. Now, I would like to start just some basics so we are all on the same page. Who am I from the basic Buddhist approach? To answer this question, who am I? I love movies, and sometimes I think about movies. I think about Jokers. Any of you love Jokers? The Dark Knight. I love his quote. Why so serious? Why so serious? I think part of the reason why people are stressed out, if you think about it, is because we're so serious about our beliefs, about our thoughts, right? We're often drowning in our thoughts and feelings. And why are we drowning our thoughts and emotions? Because we take it too seriously. So why so serious? Why so serious? Of course, I'm not saying that we all need to be like Joker. I don't want people to think the wrong way either. So when I think of why so serious, I meant that don't take our thoughts and feelings too seriously in the sense that you don't treat them as if they're a real thing, but we need to understand. And the reason and the ability to do that, the ability not to take our thoughts too serious is based on wisdom, right? It's based on insight. Our insight and our understanding of what construct our thoughts and beliefs. One key reason why we take our thoughts and feelings so serious is that and in psychology, we call this cognitive fusion. We become fused with our mental contents. We become fused with our mental factors. When I say fused, I mean you become the thoughts, you become the feelings, right? So if you are the thoughts, you are the feelings, of course we take it a lot more serious. But then what is the self, right? I mean, okay, I'm so angry, but who's the person that's so angry? You should be very interested in this question, right? So in general, there are two ways to solve a problem, upward or downward. I would say there are two ways to solve a problem, upward and downward. So if you have a problem of drinking, let's say you have a drinking problem, the downward approach would be more like try to stop drinking. Try to stop drinking, try to prevent yourself purchasing alcohol, try to move yourself to a non-alcoholic environment. That would be the downward approach, which it has its own merits. Behavior modification techniques focus a lot on that. Another way to solve the problem is really the upward approach, the source, looking for the source. What's the purpose of drinking? Okay, I drink because I'm unhappy, but how come you're unhappy? What's the source of your unhappiness? I'm unhappy because I feel that I'm a loser. Okay, so how did you realize you're a loser? Where did the idea of loser coming from? So that would be an upward approach. I would definitely most of the time people tend to solve problem with the downward approach. But I would recommend that sometimes we need to think about the upward approach, the source. What is the source? What is the source? In fact, if you are interested in Watto practice, Watto are interested in the source of all sources. What's the mind behind the all states of mind, right? I mean, so that would be an upward approach. So just some basic concept about the Buddhist approach. The way the Buddhists approach the self is that we see the self as dependently originated. So what does that mean? Another popular term you heard of is that the self is empty. And in fact, not just the self is empty, but anything, all dharma, including the self, are all empty. Now, empty is a tricky word. The original word is sunyata. And when we talk about empty, we need to talk about empty of what, right? Empty. So the way Buddhists see the self is that the self is empty of this intrinsic nature. Okay. Buddhism is empty of this independent, separate self. So this is very important. So, by the way, excuse me, I'm gonna shut off the door for a second. Excuse me. So when the Buddhists talk about there's no self, one easy way to understand this is also that there are no absolute identity with anything. So right now, what do you see here? This is a mouse. That's an identity. The most obvious way to understand this is, okay, in English, this is called a mouse. But is mouse the only name for this thing? No, because in Chinese, you call it something else. In Russian, you call it something else. So from the most obvious level, this thing already have different names. But then concept-wise, can this thing only be a mouse? Not necessarily. In fact, you could use this to serve a whole bunch of other purposes. For example, if you're a martial artist, this actually could be a weapon. Do you believe that? If you're a good martial artist, this could be a weapon. So this thing has no absolute identity, even from the conceptual level either. And if you look up this even further, this mouse is made up by everything that's not the mouse. Right. So this mouse is made up by a whole bunch of things. So what is the identity? Where is the identity of the mouse when it's made up by 100 things? Right. So if you keep analyze further, the harder you find some kind of intrinsic nature with this thing, right? And the way to, so not only things and the self are empty, concept and ideas and knowledge are also empty. So here is a quote. This is one of the quotes from Nagarjuna's Middle Path. Emptiness is taught by the conquerors as the expedient to get rid of all metaphysical views. But those for whom emptiness is a metaphysical view have been called incurable. So in other words, if you treat the concept of emptiness as a real thing, then you're in trouble, because emptiness itself is also empty. So this is sort of the fundamentals of all fundamental of the way how Buddhists view the self. So the self is empty. The self lack of absolute identity. Now, that sounds interesting to you so far? Now, to expand this emptiness in a more, in an easier way to understand, our personality, our self, and this you can explore a little bit. Our personality, our self, is made up by anything or made up by everything that's not the self. Okay. Again, the self that we thought we have is made up by everything that's not the self. Therefore, as Diamond Sutra would say, the self that's not the self is the real self. Right? The self that's not the self is the real self. So, okay, Connor has a question for me. Does that mean that the true intrinsic nature of everything is a composite of things that are in term composite themselves. So the earliest school of Buddhism say there's no self because the self is made up by 5 things. I mean, here the modern psychology would say the self is made up by more than 5 things. Oh, I mean, at least 3 categories. I mean, these are, you see, there's a little bit similar, right? Your personality is made up by biological factors. This will be more like the form if you look at the 5 skandhas, right? Your personality is also shaped by your experiences, and of course our environment, our culture has a huge part in who you are as a person. Right. Just a different way to sort of break down the self as different things. Now, the traditional Buddhism would say, okay, you see, the self is made up by the 5 skandhas. There are 5 things, but where is the self? Right? There's only 5 things, but which one is the self? Where does the self lies in? Right? So that's the way they kind of establish no self. Right? The self is changing, and the self is made up by things, by different factors. Of course, later on, the conscious only school can break down all phenomena into 100 factors. There are like 5 categories and 100 factors, 100 dharmas actually. So, and just the mental factors are 51 mental factors. But the idea is this: you break down into many things, and there's no self in anything. But then the problem with the earlier school of Buddhism is that they see, so phenomenal in the relative reality, no, sorry, in the conventional reality, there's no self. But from the ultimate truth, from the ultimate perspective, they are self. Because although there are no absolute identity, although things has no absolute identity, but things are real. So from the earlier school of Buddhism, that's a problem. So later on, like the times from Nagarjuna would say, not only the self, not only the self is empty, but the dharmas are also empty, right? Not only the self, not only the things has no absolute identity, the things in itself also do not exist. I know, like, if you look at this mouse again, we would like to, okay, we can break down into atoms. And here's one question for you: is atom really there? Right? Is there really, can the atom exist on its own? Does the atom has intrinsic nature? That's something for you to think about, right? Can the atom exist on its own? Independent, that's what intrinsic nature means. They can exist independently, always there, and unchanging. And if you break down the atom into smaller part, you have what? Neutron, electrons, protons. Can those exist on its own? So you could keep breaking down, and you will realize there's no one dharma that truly has intrinsic nature. So I'm trying to answer your question about the Buddhist notion of no self, but we can talk about it further later on. By the way, Jimmy, you probably have to keep track of time. I don't have my clock here. So what time is it now?
You have 29 minutes.
Okay, awesome. All right, 29 minutes. 29 minutes. Okay, so this is just a quick overview. And the key thing about this model, we call this the biopsychosocial model. I don't think it's in conflict with the Buddhist approach either, because what the biopsychosocial is trying to tell you is that there are no one cause of anything. And that's what dependent origination is talking about. There's no one cause. of anything, right? There's no one cause of anything. Now, keep moving forward. And if you understand, and if I want to expand the concept of this empty nature into further discussion, the three universal characteristics of existence is another way of talking about emptiness. Or actually, emptiness is an extension of those three characteristics. And I'm sure for those who are interested in Buddhism, you all heard about those three universal characteristics. The first universal characteristic is the characteristic of not self, right? Which I spend a little bit of time talk about it. Who you are is really not who you really are. So, and this is great, nowadays Facebook, when we see people, you always have to discount what you see because people are just so different. You could be one time I saw a real hot girl on Facebook, and then when you scroll down later, you realize she's a guy. So I mean, you really see anything. Anything is possible nowadays. Of course, I'm using Facebook as an example, but we all have a Facebook version of ourselves, and we take that as real. And we take that, so we all have like a fixed image of who we are, and we take that as real. So last week I also talked about Santa Claus, right? The teaching of not self or no self is to teach you that you're not what you think you are. Yeah. It's not that there's nothing there, but you're not what you think you are. Another way to talk about not self is really impermanence. One way to understand not self or no self is through changes, right? Nothing is permanent. Nothing is permanent. Everything is in a state of flux. If you understand impermanence, then you also understand, I'm going to use my mouse again. Did I touch my mouse? Can people answer this question? Did I touch the mouse? Beth, what do you think? Did I touch the mouse? You sure? Have you ever heard, can you step in the same river twice? Can you touch this mouse? Beth, what do you think? You sure?
Water is always moving.
Okay. How about this mouse?
Is that mouse moving? I mean, I'm looking at a picture of you touching that mouse. I don't even know if that mouse is there because I'm looking at an image of it.
Okay, that's good. That's a start, right? But how about for me? Do you think I'm touching the mouse? I mean, of course, no, I'm not psychotic, so of course I'm touching the mouse, but I'm talking philosophically. Do you think I'm touching the mouse, right?
Now I don't know the answer.
Connor, you want to try?
I think that technically, I'm not sure if this is actually true, but I think technically, on like a molecular level, the atoms of your hand are, I believe, like technically not actually in contact with the atoms of the mouse. They're just close enough to like sort of count. So it kind of reminds me of like this Greek paradox I heard like a while back, where like I forget if it was Achilles, but some Greek hero shoots an arrow, and that arrow, like every X number of seconds, the distance between that arrow and the target halves, and so by that logic, the arrow can never reach the target.
Good. That's a paradox, right? That's the arrow paradox. The arrow paradox is pointing out a fundamental issue that's related to not self. The idea, the fundamental thinking error, the fundamental cognitive error people have is to see all phenomenon as a thing. So when we see the time as a thing, yes, it will never touch, right? It will never touch the end. So yes, so I think that's related to this one. I think the answer you gave is also related to quantum mechanics, right? I mean, it's really the electron that's bouncing off another electron. So yes, from that level, I'm never touching it. But from the impermanent perspective, I'm always changing, and this mouse is always changing. So I'm never touching this mouse. That makes sense, right? The same person is never touching the same mouse. So no Dharma touching at all. If I'm not touching the mouse, think about the thoughts in your head. When you think about the thoughts, I'm an idiot. The word I and the word am, the word and the word idiot, they really have no relationship in a sense, right? They're never touching each other either. So anyway, I like to use this quote. This is from James Bugento, one of the existential psychologists, and it's pointing out a common sort of habit, a sort of a default cognitive distortion that we have. The default cognitive distortion we have is that human are meaning-seeking animals. However, the reality is moving fast like a flux. Yet we're always seeking constancy when there's no constancy. Right? So why Buddha teaches us that things are empty of intrinsic nature? That's because the fundamental error we have is we like to see things having intrinsic nature. We like to see things are independent. We like to see things are always there. We like to see things as unchanging. If that's the way we see the world, that's the way we see the reality, then that's the way we see ourselves. That makes sense? Right? It's the same cognitive problem we have in seeing everything. Okay. So impermanence and no self is all related to the third one, which is dukkha. The reason why we suffer is because we do not accept impermanence. We want things other than it is. We do not like to have change. We either like things to stay the same, or we want to change whatever we already have, right? And the reason why you don't accept change is because you see the self as fixed, right? So without clearly understanding the source of your suffering, it's almost like you're stabbing yourself every day and you're blaming the knife. That's what sort of the suffering that we're doing from a Buddhist perspective. Like we're always creating suffering without even knowing why we're suffering, right? So here are just a few ways to understand the self. The self is complicated, right? One way to understand the self is that the self is sort of often only our mental representation, right? We tend to reify mental images. We tend to have a story, and we tend to have images of ourselves. And the self, our self-image is really constantly changing, like the cartoon, right? This is like cartoon, if you think about it. And if you look at this for a second, any of you see this before? Let me see. So this is a fan clock. Look like a blade. Keep it. This is an advertisement. It takes longer. Okay. And when you turn it on, let me go back. When you turn it on, you see a clock. So this is the same way you can think about the self. Is the self there or not there? We form image of the self because there are multiple selves, right? From the concept of impermanence, right? Is that clock real or not real? Something for us to think about, which is really related to the self, right? Is our self real or not real? Right? And another issue about the self is that we like to see the self as, I mean, we change like the river, but somehow we see, and ourselves is like the river, but somehow we see the self as if it's never changed, just like the name of the river, right? Or a picture of a river. It's like this is like a picture. I went to India, I took a picture of the river, the Ganges River, right? A famous river. The river is always changing, but then when I come home, I only come home with a picture. Is this picture the river? No, this picture is totally, it only captures a little bit of the river and only very slight impression of the river. But this is what we often do as human beings as well. Our self is like a river that's constantly changing, or like the waterfall. Our mental stream is always changing. Our mental stream is always moving. Yet we tend to take a picture. We tend to take a picture of the river and we see that as the self. So that's another sort of mental habit we have, right? That's another mental habit we have. Another mental habit we have regarding the self is this. These are the pictures of, in Japan, actually, the thing is in the famous Zen temple in Kyoto. These are the two figures of the thunder and lightning god, the thunder god, lightning god. We tend to, this is what we do. Like in the ancient time, when people look at the sky, when people see lightning and thunder, it's too difficult for them to understand what are the causes of lightning and thunder. So back then, people just come up with the idea of the lightning and thunder god. So this is sort of a way to make our life easier. We use personification, right? We in the West, we would describe what Thor is the god of thunder, right? God of thunder. So we tend to, okay, so for someone who doesn't understand, that's an easy way to understand the phenomena. So the science teacher will tell you, well, there's no Thor and there's no God of thunder. Again, this is the same as the teaching of no self from Buddhism. There's no self, but does not mean there's nothing there. That's very important to understand, right? When we say there's no self, it does not mean nothing happening. When we say there's no Thor, there's a whole bunch of other things that happen at the same time. So this is another mental habit we have. We tend to use personification. So the problem of the self is that, what's wrong with it, right? It does has evolutionary values. It is important to have a self from a evolutionary value, because the self has some purpose. The self has some purpose. However, if we take it too seriously, if we elaborate on this function of this is really one of the many functions of the mind. But if we elaborate it too much on it, it becomes a problem. It becomes a problem. So what's the problem? What's the problem? The problem is that we tend to oversimplify, right? We tend to oversimplify. And when we oversimplify the image of ourselves and the image of others, it creates conflict. It creates conflict. And when we oversimplify, we also over-identify with our mental content. So that goes back to what I said earlier. When we take our thoughts and feeling too seriously, we become our thoughts and feelings. And when you see yourself in this very limited way, when you see yourself as a thing, right? When we thinify ourselves, we start to impose limits on ourselves. And we do that to other people too. We do that to other people too, right? For example, we love to label people. Right? I mean, that's one tendency we have. Very easy. Like nowadays, I mean, when I browse Facebook, it's so easily to see how people just label one another. Especially during, I guess now is what, September, then October, then November, and then we're gonna vote. So you start to see people label others as Democrat, Republican. It's as if you're Republican, there's only one Republican. If you're Democrat, there's only one Democrat, right? And once we label you as Republican or Democrat, somehow you become a thing. You become the thing. And if I see and why do we do that? In psychology, we call this like splitting. People love splitting their world into two parts, good and bad, right? This equals good, and if I'm this, then that means everyone else is bad. And why do we do this? It's much easier just to simplify. Instead of seeing yourself as complication, as gray, so easy to see yourself as white and everyone's black. Right? And whatever darkness you have, you could project it out. You could project it out to other people. So this is another way to sort of hold on to a self. Okay. So these are all common problems with the self, and this is how reincarnation basically happened. We misunderstand the reality, how the reality is constructed. And with this misunderstanding, that leads to self-referential perspective, which set up the stage for distress and which leads to additional misunderstanding. This is basically how reincarnation, and I have in Chinese 12-link chain. So the dependent origination. So if you want to simplify reincarnation, I would say this is sort of a quick way to summarize. Misunderstanding leads to self-referential perspectives, which leads to distress, which leads to more misunderstanding. It's a cycle. So,
Dr. Lin, you have about 10 minutes left.
Awesome. Okay. So the purpose of today's talk is really to experientially, we may not understand what not self mean, but at least conceptually, we can try to see if we can understand a little bit. So today's talk hopefully will help you to come up with some cognitive restructuring strategies, at least some ways to help you to challenge the way we think a little bit. So next time when you think of yourself, oh, I'm so-and-so, I'm a loser, I'm so smart, Johnny is dumb. I mean, when we start to label ourselves and other something, think about these cognitive strategies that may somehow restructure the way you think about things. And if you can just restructure the way you think about things, that already give you a little bit more freedom. So here are just some of the basic analogy that can help you to think about what the self is, right? So here are just different analogy of what the self is. So in terms of language, if you see the self, if we reify the self becomes like a noun. But instead of seeing the self as a noun, we can see the self more like a verb, right? No self is more like not doing our usual self, not repeating the same old story. In fact, you can think of Zen as sort of a verb without the self and the object. Self is like the word. Self is like the verb without subject and object, right? If we see this, and fluidity is also another way, an analogy to understand the self. The self, if you see the self as a thing, you become more like a piece of ice, right? But we don't want to be a piece of ice. We want to be more fluid, right? So Bruce Lee would say, "Be water, my friend," right? So we want to be water. We do not want to be ice. Although water and ice are the same. Our Buddha nature the same, but you don't need to be the ice, right? Relationship-wise, when we see ourselves as a thing, we tend to see the thing as if it's always there. It's independent, has nothing to do with anyone else, anything else. If you see the self as empty, if you actually see the self as empty, the self is full of relationships. In fact, that's another way to look at emptiness. It's relationships, right? Not only you see the self here, but you see all the self that's not. You see all the things that made up the self, right? Because the self is made up by everything that's not the self. If you like physics, light is another good analogy. One model seeing the light has what, photons, particles. Another way of seeing light is more like waves. So that would be another way of understanding itself. Of course, permanent versus changing. That's the traditional way of sort of challenging the way we view the self. This is sort of my favorite. Analogy, and I probably will end here today with my favorite analogy. Here is a picture of a grandpa in Taiwan who loved to play Pokemon. He has, I think, like every day he has like 21. I think he had like up to 21 iPhones just to play Pokemon Go. Right? So if you think that an iPhone is only good for Pokemon Go, that's a problem, right? Just like if you give an iPhone to your grandma and your grandma thought an iPhone is just a phone, that's a problem. Now, what's the analogy here? Seeing the iPhone is just a phone is like mistaking who you are now as the real self, right? Who you think you are is really not who you think you are. Who you think you are is not who you really are. So the practice of Zen is to practice that, is the realization that we're really not just the Pokemon Go, we're not just the phone, but we're an iPhone. We have many, many more functions, right? Once you realize Pokemon Go is just one of the apps on your phone, you still could keep the app, it still has its function, but you can rearrange all other apps on the phone in a way that can be beneficial to many others. Of course, if you analyze further, you're really not the iPhone either, because everything on the iPhone really came from the cloud, right? It really came from the cloud. So in some way, an iPhone is just and one of the many applications of the cloud. That makes sense, right? And what's the cloud? Cloud is definitely an example of this interconnectedness. And if you look at further, of course, if you want to look even further, the cloud is run by electricity. The electricity is always there, and the cloud is just one of the many functions of electricity. And electricity is always there, whether you realize it or not. So the end of talk today is that we're not the Pokemon, but we're the iPhone. Now we can open up for question. I guess we have a few more minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay. So Wendy has a question for me: how to face the conflict of different ideas in the head. Well, this is one of the sort of the classic of all classic. In fact, not only human has this problem, you could do this to the monkeys as well. Monkeys, little mice, you could like have their 2 favorite foods there. They actually have experiments of like showing 2 favorite foods for the mice, and they have a hard time to pick the one they like, or 2 punishments there, and they have a hard time to pick which one they like. Right. So often we have how do you deal with the conflict when you have 2 conflicting ideas in your head? And actually, that's what Freud loved to talk about all the time. Why we suffer? Because of conflict within ourselves. And people come up all sort of magical ways to run away from the conflict. I would say look for the source, right? Remember I was talking about look for the source. What are the source of the conflict, right? The source of the conflict must have something to do with the self. So how did you put yourself in those 2 conflicts? Most likely, self A is having some kind of conflict with self B, right? But neither self are true. So which one is the real self? This is very an abstract way of talking about. I mean, the thing about question like this is abstract, so you can only answer it in an abstract manner. But I think in a practical manner, I would say just be very curious about where those ideas come from. Where did they originate from? Be very curious about it. That's probably the most easiest way to start. Just be curious. Instead of take those 2 ideas too seriously, be curious about it. Any other question for me? Okay, I have 3 participants raised their hand. Sorry, I have to see who raised their hand. Simon? Simon, right?
Miranda, and
Yeah,
Connor.
I'm Simon.
Hey, Simon.
Hey, I hope this is a short answer, but how would you, just from a very practical sense, how do you think that if you adopted this right view very fully, and you got it, how does that change, or does it change someone's behavior as they, how they relate to, say, physical survival, competition in the marketplace, and ambition? Does it look any different for somebody that's sort of adopted this right view versus, say, the people that, go ahead.
I would say you have one less burden to worry about, right? Like when you don't have as rigid view of yourself, you actually see more options, right? So in marketplace, it's like I always have to do business one way because that's the way I think is the only way to show me I'm smart, intelligent, or successful. or I have to make money certain amount, otherwise I'm a failure, right? I mean, people have all sort of baggage that comes in with their decision making. But once you're a bit more free from that, you may actually see more options. I would say life is, I would say all our life is like a piece of art. We're an artist of our life, and when you have a rigid view of self, when you like see yourself as a thing, you kind of sort of minimize yourself to only making art one way. Whereas I see that Zen and psychotherapy, both East and Western wisdom, help you to become more free, to be a bit more artistic in living. So that would be the big picture.
That sounds nice.
Right, great.
Thank you.
Miranda from Vancouver. Wow, is that Vancouver? Yeah. Miranda.
Hi,
Hey.
can you hear me?
Yay. Yes.
Okay, hey. Sorry, didn't unmute myself here. So thank you. Great to hear you talk again.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you the Heart Sutra. I do this every morning. I do this part of my morning service, and putting this in the context of the Heart Sutra, where we say all five skandhas are empty, and then so no suffering, and then form is another form. Self is form is no other than emptiness, and emptiness not other than self, and then form is precisely emptiness, and then emptiness is precisely form. So how I'm trying to put that in the context of the topic of today's topic.
Oh, the Heart Sutra is excellent for our topic. The whole Heart Sutra is telling you, I mean, the Heart Sutra is basically saying what? The five skandhas are empty, right? Another way of saying that is the self is empty, right? And not only the self is empty, but even wisdom is empty, right? Because if you read later on, there's nothing to gain, right? There's no wisdom and there's no suffering. And the reason why there's wisdom and there's suffering is because we tend to see things as a thing. We see wisdom as a wisdom. We see suffering as a suffering, right? I mean, so this whole Heart Sutra is teaching us to free from our cognitive distortion, which is this seeing things as having intrinsic nature. So the Heart Sutra is really from the school. I mean, it's an excellent, excellent sutra. That's my favorite sutra. Yes. So, hope that's a quick answer for you.
Great, that's good. That's fantastic. Thank you. It's actually sort of because to me it was like two separate things. No, hang on, they're the same. No, hang on, is that in my mind, or am I going through this intrinsic process again? Great, yeah, thank you very much.
But yeah, it's great, very relevant to what we're talking about today. And Connor?
Yeah, I have kind of a similar question. I'm reading through Patriarch Huineng's Platform Sutra.
Yeah.
And in it, he's talking about how we have to see like our original face, or that's what's referred to in the in at least my translation.
Yeah.
And is that kind of related to how, like, I guess the original nature is empty? So in that way, is like the original nature like is that, like, I guess that the original face that he like talks about, is that the same emptiness?
So yes, I think quick answer to that is the original face is what? Our self nature, right? Right. Our empty nature, right? Our empty nature. And if I could answer that, I would be a Zen master right now, right? Yeah. So I'm not going to pretend I could answer it, but the concept is to make us become interested, right? So, you know, I mean, the way we view reality is distorted, right? Because we tend to label the reality with concepts and words and ideas. So what's the reality before concepts and words? That's for you to think about. That's for you to explore, right? Right. And what are you before words and concept? So what is it? Right. So that is related to. So the platform. So my Pokemon idea is really related to your question as well, right? My Pokemon.
I see. Oh
right?
yeah, actually.
Right.
I
Because
see. Thank you.
the self itself is not a problem, you know. If you realize, so the self is just illusory mind, but the mind is just mind. The mind, if you use it correctly, is true mind. If you use it incorrectly, it's illusory mind. A MacBook Pro to a hacker is a weapon. To a grandma is a piece of junk. I mean, you know, so yes, we all have Buddha nature, but how we understand it make a difference, huge differences. Yeah. I think this is all pretty philosophical, but when I work with people in real life, I tend not to get into very philosophical. I think that what helps me in question like this, original phase, is just to work upwards. What are the source of your distress? Right? Before you try to solve the original phase, first let's try to solve how you see yourself. And then we go upwards. Practically speaking, at least when I'm working with people, that's more like immediate. Most of us are not Zen master yet anyway, so. Good.
I see. Yep. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other? From team. Okay. Thank you, team. All right. I guess this is it. I guess I went over time as well. Thank you very much. I really enjoy spending time with all of you this morning. I think you all asked great questions, and I think your questions make the discussion even more interesting. So good luck. Keep looking for yourself, and let me know when you find it. Yes.